Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam wa ala Rasulillah. Amma ba'd. Just want to take a few brief moments to discuss how to deal with suspected race soldiers or white supremacists who are in disguise of police officers. This is going to be according to Neely Fuller. This is from his book, The United Independent Compensatory Code System of Concept, a compensatory counter-racist code. And he delves into the 9 areas of activity. Well, I'm going to be dealing with the issue of law. But I was going over this book again and decided to just briefly talk about this particular issue of what to do when a person of color is apprehended, for lack of better words, by the police officers. So Neely Fuller, he says, according to compensatory counter-racist logic, it is impossible for a white supremacist to be a police officer, or for a police officer to be a white supremacist. The correct term for a law enforcement officer who practices white supremacy or racism is a suspected race soldier, right? Or suspected racist, or suspected white supremacist. So he goes on to say, police do not commit brutality. Incorrect law enforcement officers do not commit brutality. They do commit. Incorrect law enforcement officers do commit brutality, wherein law enforcement don't. An incorrect law enforcement officer is any person who speaks or acts in such a manner that produces or maintains non-justice. That is, non-balance between people, right? So this is his definition in the book of what a police officer is and isn't, and what an incorrect police officer is or isn't, right? So, moving along to the issue of when you find yourself in the presence of law enforcement, persons, and in general, interactions with them, do the following, right? Now, check out these 5 points that he goes into with regards to how you deal with law enforcement officials if you come into contact with them or if there's any type of interaction. And of course, he is talking to non-white people, right? So, he says, while in the presence of law enforcement persons, he puts in inverted commas, law enforcement, and in your general interactions with them, do the following. Number one, very important. Be as calm and as courteous as you possibly can. This may or may not work, but this is his opinion. And Mr. Neely Fuller, being an older person, there's some wisdom behind remaining calm and courteous. You don't exacerbate the situation, right? 2, he says, answer all questions in a manner that is calm and constructive, right? Be calm when you're answering questions, and be constructive in your answering. Tell them like it is, right? Be truthful. 3, he says, if you are not absolutely certain of the answer to a question, say that you are not sure. That's all you have to tell them, that you're not sure. 4, do not use any profane language. And 5, do not do anything or say anything that may cause a greater problem. Now, this is his position that he takes with regards to people of color or non-white people. These are things that they should do if they find themselves in the presence of law enforcement. And one of the things that we see a lot on social media is the fact that many times we want to get into a challenging, confrontational, way, or have confrontational behavior when confronted by law enforcement, right? He's saying don't do that because, for the most part, this may agitate a suspected race soldier. And this may give the race soldier, in his mind or her mind, justification to cause psychological or bodily harm, right? So this is why it's not a good idea to ask a lot of questions with regards to, why are you stopping me? What's the problem, officer? And the reason being, if you look at this, you've probably seen videos online of people who were questioned by the police. And it goes something like, am I being detained? Well, if I'm not being detained, then you have no cause to hold me. Am I under arrest? You have no cause to hold me. And for the most part, generally speaking, yeah, this is true. But unfortunately, when it comes to people of color, you may not be able to get away with that. And this is something that many of us have to be cognizant of. You can't do what your white counterparts do. Although, legally speaking, you may be correct. That's the reality of the world that we live in. And I'm not saying we should bow down to it, but what I am saying is, if possible, do some of these things that he mentioned, to the point where if you live through the engagement or the altercation or whatever the case may be, then you live another day to be able to challenge these things in the future, right? So basically he's saying, do not do anything whatsoever, language otherwise, that can make the situation worse, right? And this is something we Muslims, right? African-American descent, Muslims who are from the Latino population, right? These are realities that we know, right? These are realities that we have to deal with, right? So we may disagree with his methods here, but at the same time, there's some wisdom in it. So in talking about police officers, he goes on to say, now check this out. Check out what he says with regards to police officers. Wa alaikum salam rahmatullah. So he says, always suspect, very important, always suspect that a white person is a white supremacist racist if he or she approaches you with their weapon drawn. Like in a situation where you don't pose a threat, and they have their hand on their guns, or they have their guns drawn in a situation wherein there's really no need for it, then you need to automatically put in your mind that this individual is a white supremacist or AKA a race soldier, right? Now check this out. He goes on to say, he said, as long as white supremacy racism exists, expect to be maimed, killed, or falsely accused by any white person who confronts you by presenting himself or herself as some form of law enforcement official, police person, sheriff, constable, investigator, soldier, etc. Right? This is his view. Right? So I'm bringing this primarily for us Muslims to basically wake up, particularly those of us who are African American or Hispanic, right? Whether you be brown or Afro-Latino, whatever the case may be, whatever you call yourself. If you are a person of color, then it may be in your best interest to check out what Mr. Neely Fuller says about dealing with law enforcement when you come in contact. Because unfortunately, one of the problems that I see, and many have spoke on it, that when we take our Shahada, we accept Islam, we have the propensity to think that the Shahada is going to prevent issues of white supremacy from affecting us. Some of us, by our actions, right? We think because we may wear a thobe or a Kurdish shirt or shalwar kameez, whatever the case may be, gutra, right? Izar, all these things, and all these things are fine. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with having a Islamic identity. Nothing wrong with looking like a Muslim, right? And there's some fiqh with regards that we're not going to get into the issues of fiqh regarding that and the issues of wala wal bara. We're not going to get into that. The point that I'm making is, despite all of these things, none of this negates the reality that you may be apprehended by race soldiers within police departments or sheriff departments. This doesn't negate that reality. And so I just wanted to share some of these points that Mr. Neely Fuller brings out. So he goes on. He says, explanation. He says, there are many white people who identify themselves as officers of the law and who believe in racism, white supremacy. There are many white people who have death-making weapons, who have the correct intentions. There are many who do not. This is a reality, right? He's making it clear here. He's not saying all white officers are suspected white supremacists. He makes it clear that there are some that have correct intentions and there are those who don't, right? But you need to keep these in mind when you come into close proximity to these individuals. He says, if a white person says that he or she is a police officer, but speaks or acts in a manner that indicates that he or she is not a police officer, but a white supremacist or racist, consider him or her a suspected race soldier, right? Or a suspected white supremacist who pretends to be a police officer. Because if you remember, or those of you who just joined, when you listen to this talk again after it ends, in the beginning, he says what? A police officer does not commit brutality. They don't. And he says an incorrect police officer does commit brutality. So he gets into the issue of correct officer and an incorrect officer, right? So he says, if a non-white person says that he or she is a police officer, now, non-white is the terminology he likes to use, meaning a person of color, African American, Hispanic, Native American, Catholic, like this, right? If a non-white person says that he or she is a police officer, but speaks or acts in a manner that indicates that he or she is not a police officer, but a person who is using force to help a suspected race soldier to enforce the practice of white supremacy or racism, it is correct to use the term victim of white supremacy, right? This person is a victim if he upholds racist white supremacy ways with the use of force, especially on people that look like himself or herself, right? So he said he said victim of white supremacy to apply to the non-white person. The term law and order has been used by the white supremacist racists in a manner that helps to disguise the action or practice of white supremacy racism, right? So I just wanted to share, because I was going back over this book, and I just wanted to share some of his views on what to do when confronted or apprehended, or when you're in close proximity to a police officer who behaves in a way that clearly shows that they have some racist tendencies, right? And lastly, I will read his last part. He says, if you are confronted by a suspected race soldier pretending to be a police officer, immediately go into danger mode. Regard yourself as being captured and a completely helpless prisoner of war. Why? Because you really have no authority. And I mentioned earlier, wherein you have some people who made videos, especially European Americans, that make videos on how to deal with the police when they falsely stop or falsely apprehend anyone, right? The problem with these type of videos is that it works for the European American, but the reality is it doesn't work for the African American or the Hispanic, right? It doesn't work. And you may find yourself beaten or killed trying to exercise that so-called right. So again, when they pull you over, show them your license, registration, comply, ask questions, right? Do it in a calm manner, answer their questions constructively, right? Don't come with the attitude, man, what you want? Or, officer, why you stopping? What's the purpose for you stopping me here? Hear what they got to say. Be nice. Many of us don't want to do that. I get it. But I have the propensity to agree with Mr. Neely Fuller here. Why? Because the situation can escalate quickly for us. You don't have the same rights. This is a reality. And in this issue, with regards to being able to exercise your right of not being detained by police officers, if you read the book, New Jim Crow, right? Michelle Alexander, right? She mentions this issue about, the police officers detaining people. For example, they stop you and they ask, can I search the car? You're like, no. And for real, that's your right, because they have to have a warrant. But what would they do? What would they do? They'll detain you. Yeah, am I under arrest? No. Okay, then I'm out. You try it. You try it, and you're a person of color. Try that and see how that works out for you. So it's best to comply. And if they apprehend you, like what he said here, consider yourself captured, prisoner of war, or whatever. Because why? This is something that is familiar to them. This is a behavior that they've participated in since what? The inception of the country. When you talk about runaway slaves, all the way until what? Law enforcement. These are realities, right? So, in closing, just a reminder, and I reiterate, Alhamdulillah, Allah has guided us to Islam, guided us to the Sunnah, Alhamdulillah, many of us, and many of us from amongst our people, from amongst the African Americans and the Hispanic population, many of us continue to say our Shahada, right? Alhamdulillah. It's a beautiful thing. But that Shahada, in no way, shape, form, or fashion, understand what I'm saying? Your Shahada in no way, shape, form, or fashion protects you from what? White supremacy, racism. Of course, everything is in the hands of Allah, and Allah does as He will. But at the same time, who from amongst us can guarantee that Allah won't test us with the same issues that's going on within the African American community, within the Hispanic community here in America? Who's to say that Allah won't test the believers with the same issue? And don't forget, out of all the people who were shot and killed, here in America, it was just a few years ago, one of our brothers was murdered. Just a few years. Body riddled with bullets. I think Zaid Shakir, I think he was one of the people who performed the janazah, I believe. My memory serves me correctly. I don't remember the brother's name. But he had, I think, like 3 children. The point is, though, is that he was a victim. He became a victim of race soldiers. And so this is what I want to present with regards to how to deal with race soldiers if you come into contact or close proximity to them, or if you are detained or apprehended or what have you, how you should be. It's hard to remain calm because 1,000 things are running through your mind. But if you can take the opportunity to think, then it will be better for you. Despite them doing things from a psychological standpoint to get you riled up, to cause you to make a move. And we had this situation here in North Carolina with the killing of the guy in Elizabeth City, right? They said the police were justified because he drove his car into the police officers. He almost hit one. So it was like a technicality because they said that the car became a deadly weapon. But when you look at the video, you had like 8 officers screaming different things. Show me your hands. Put your hands up. Show me your hands. And they was yelling different things. Guns drawn. So guess what he did? He panicked. And he backed up, trying to get away. Realized I came back up to get away. So let me turn to try to get away from him. But one officer moved out the way quickly. Right? One officer moved out the way quickly to avoid getting hit. And that was the justification to unload. That was the justification to unload on them. So I'm saying this because there's a certain type of tactic that many of the officers use to get you to react. For example, a tactic that many of them like to use is to encroach on your personal space, right? They encroach on your personal space. In the United States of America, a person's personal space is, from a cultural standpoint, an arm's length, right? One arm's length. Anything closer than that arm's length, we get a little uncomfortable. We may back up to put distance between us and the person that's getting too close. Or we may what? Unconsciously put out our hand to keep that person what? At bay, or from what? Encroaching our personal space. But if the person is a police officer and you put your hand out, guess what they're going to get you with? Assault, right? It's these psychological games that they play, and these psychological games that they utilize in the different tactics of policing, which, if you're not aware of them, then you'll become a victim, right? You'll become a victim. And this is what happened to the gentleman here in North Carolina in the town of Elizabeth City. You know, he panicked. You know, so many officers had guns pointed at him. He panicked. And he only had moments. Who knows what was going through his mind? He only had moments to act. And he chose to try to get away. But he almost hit an officer. So they gave justification to, you know, murder. So again, I'm mentioning this because, like I said, I can't help but reiterate it enough that we have to be cognizant of these realities. We have to be cognizant of these realities because it can happen to Muslims. And if we're not sharp and we keep walking around in denial or oblivious because we took our shahada, we know Arabic, or some of us are studying Arabic, or whatever the case, some of us studied overseas, whatever the case, it don't matter. But if we're not cognizant, then the same thing can happen to us. We have to be cognizant, and we have to teach our children and grandchildren and how to deal with the police officers if they come into close proximity. So this is what I want to present. It's almost Maghrib time here. So inshallah, if this was any benefit and whatever was correct, no doubt it's from Allah. And if there's anything incorrect, you can make no doubt about it. It's from me and the shaitan. Make no mistake about that one. So I end. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Shadun la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.